Hi everyone, I'm Dina with Mills Family Gardening, and in this video we'll be talking about winter sowing. We'll be talking about what is winter sowing, when do we winter sow, what containers do we use, and what potting mixes can we use, and also where do we place our jugs for winter sowing. Also, we'll be talking about the differences between our milder climate, we live in North Texas, zone 8A, and also cooler climates, and how it all affects winter sowing. What is winter sowing? Winter sowing is sowing seeds in containers in the winter and keeping them outside. It mimics the way seeds germinate in nature. Plants drop seeds, the seeds stay in the soil all throughout the winter in a dormant state, and when the soil reaches the right temperature, that's when the seeds germinate and sprout. Essentially, when you do winter sowing, you create mini greenhouses that you can move around depending on the weather and the sun position. Winter sowing can be done without any heating mats, grow lights, special seedling trays. All you need for winter sowing is containers that you most likely already have on hand, some potting mix, seeds, and also water to water your potting mix. Also, with winter sowing, you don't need to harden off your seedlings since they've been outside from the beginning. They're used to all kinds of weather, and so whenever they're ready to be transplanted, you simply can move them into the ground right away. When do we winter sow? A lot of people recommend doing winter sowing sometime after Christmas, but also it depends a lot on the climate you live in. For example, in our milder climate, we can start doing winter sowing in the beginning of January and all throughout January. If you live in a colder climate, then most likely you will start winter sowing in February or even March. Here in our milder climate, we might want to start winter sowing in February if we want to sow warm weather seeds. Where we live, January is usually the coldest month, and this year it has been very cold, but the first part of January here was very warm. Our weather was in the 60s, and so I winter sowed some cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli seeds in this box that I use for winter sowing, and they have already come up. But next weekend the temperatures are supposed to go down to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and whereas mature cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower plants will tolerate the temperature just fine if we cover them, their seedlings are not that strong. So next weekend I might need to bring them either inside or move them closer to the house where it's warmer, because most likely they will not survive those cold temperatures. So after your seedlings have come up, even though they've been outside and you expect really cold temperatures, you would still need to provide extra protection for them because seedlings are more susceptible to cold temperatures. Also, when it comes to warm weather plants, you might want to wait a little longer to winter sow those seeds, because if those seeds sit in damp and cold soil, they might simply rot. Let's say I want to winter sow vincas. I would not want to start them in January. I would want to wait till February or even March to winter sow them and keep them outdoors. And that's when our temperatures warm up significantly. And since vincas are warm weather flowers, they require higher temperatures for germination. Winter sowing is great for starting perennial seeds. For example, here I started some perennial flowers from seed, and since perennial seeds require some time of cold stratification, then January here in North Texas is the perfect time to winter sow them because it's the coldest month and the seeds will stay through really cold temperatures and get stratified. So I have some seeds of standing cypress, blackfoot daisy, white echinacea, four-nerve daisy, and Luna pink swirl hibiscus. I started these seeds about 2 weeks ago, and we already had freezing temperatures in the low 20s Fahrenheit. So they have already got some chill hours, but like I said, we're expected to get more freezing temperatures, so this time is perfect for them to get winter sowed. Also, when sowing warm weather annuals like vincas, for example, be patient with them because they will take much longer to germinate because they're waiting for the soil to reach the right temperature. Let's talk about what containers can we use for winter sowing. You can use any containers. It can be milk jugs, it can be plastic boxes, it can be restaurant takeout containers, it can be salad mix containers, it can be 2-liter soda bottles. You can use any containers as long as they're clear, translucent, and as long as they're 6 inches deep. For example, this box is about 6 inches deep, and I could have filled up this box with about 3 inches of soil at the bottom, and then the other 3 inches at the top would be left for the plant to grow and for the leaves to take up the space. Or a lot of people like to use milk jugs simply because we have plenty of those. So what you would do with a milk jug, you would cut it about 1/3 of the way up. You can cut it all across and make sure to leave 1 inch of it uncut underneath the handle, and it will work as a hinge for your bottle, so you can shut the lid and it won't get lost. No matter what container you use, make sure to have drainage holes at the bottom of the box or container, and also make sure to have ventilation holes on the sides of the container and also at the top of the container, so when it rains or snows, that water can get inside of the container and water your seedlings or seeds. Here I'm using a plastic container, but I decided not to fill it up with soil. I'm simply reusing the seedling tray that I got in a nursery with some pansies, I think. And since I already have this, I decided to use it, and it keeps my seedlings more organized. I think I like it better this way. And also, I decided not to put any holes in the lid of this container. That way, when I shut the container on really cold days or nights, it will create a really warm environment for the seedlings, and they will be much safer inside. And on days when it warms up, especially when the temperatures get higher than 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I would open the lid and just leave the container open. If I don't, the seedlings will get too hot and might die. So anytime it gets 60 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, make sure to open the lids of your containers, or if you cannot open the lid, like in this milk jug, you can simply move them to a place where it gets shade in the afternoon, because afternoons are usually the hottest parts of the day. I used our hot glue gun to make holes in the plastic box. A hot glue gun works just fine for that. I mentioned that for this box, I decided not to make holes in the lid because I can simply open the lid since it's so easy to open it. But for containers like milk jugs, when you seal them, it would be difficult for you to remove the tape and try to open them. For that reason, make sure to create some ventilation holes in containers like a milk jug or a soda bottle, containers that are harder to open. Some vegetable plants can get really tall. For example, tomato plants require much more space than just 3 inches at the top. For that reason, a milk jug would probably work better, but my tomato plants get even taller than the milk jug, and for that reason, I would probably use a tall soda bottle for 1 tomato plant, and I would put probably 1 tomato plant only in that 1 soda bottle. Let's talk about what potting soil do we use for containers. Make sure you use a very high quality potting soil. I like to use Miracle-Gro container mix or Miracle-Gro potting soil. I've been using it for several years, and all my seedlings have always been happy, strong, and have never failed. I do not recommend using a seed starting mix simply because it does not have enough nutrients to carry the plant from seed starting all the way to being transplanted outside. With a seed starting mix, you would have to fertilize your seedlings once they get their first set of true leaves. You don't have to use Miracle-Gro brand. Use whatever brand you like, but make sure it's a really good quality potting soil, because your seedlings and the health of your plants really depends on what potting soil you use from the very beginning. If you use a low quality potting mix from the beginning, then your seedlings will be wimpy, yellow, weak, and they will never really grow into strong plants, and you will lose time in your planting schedule. So make sure to use the best quality potting soil you can find. How do we sow seeds with a winter sowing method? You sow seeds the same way you would normally sow them. When you fill up the container with a potting mix, make sure you make the potting mix moist. We need to sow the seeds into the moist soil. If you sow seeds into dry soil and then try to water them after sowing them, what will happen is the seeds and the soil will float up, the soil will start rejecting the water and will not be absorbing it. So all the water with the seeds and the soil will start overflowing, and you might lose your seeds and some of the soil. So make sure to make your soil moist before you plant your seeds. I actually already started some tomato seeds inside of the house under our grow light, and they have come up, but I forgot to plant some Golden Jubilee tomato seeds, and that's what I'm gonna do with this winter sowing method. So I'm using a milk jug, and in this milk jug, I would want to have about 3 or 4 plants of tomato seedlings. And this is another important rule for winter sowing. Do not overcrowd your seeds, because when they sprout and start growing and start taking up all the nutrients from the soil, they will turn weak, and that's not what we want. So make sure not to overcrowd them. So I'm going to poke holes in about 4 spots here, so I can have about 4 tomato seedlings. And I'm going to plant the seeds at the same depth that I would normally plant tomato seedlings. I'm not going to keep them just on top of the soil. I'm going to plant them about 1/4 of an inch deep. If you sow larger seeds, they need to be sowed deeper than 1/4 of an inch. It all depends on the size of your seeds. After I put the seeds in the soil, I'm going to cover them like I normally do. And since the soil is already moist, I can simply spray them with a spray bottle. But this soil is really moist, so I'm not going to spray it. And now I'm simply going to cover the lid. Ideally, you would want to use a duct tape to tape your container, but since we're out of it, I'm just going to use a packing tape, and that's okay. So I'm going to take the tape and simply put it in the middle of the cut that I made on the bottle here, and try to tape it as well as I can. Sometimes a tape can get messy, so do your best taping your container. Obviously, it doesn't look very neat, especially that we use the translucent packing tape. If we use a duct tape, then you would not see all the seams and some openings here. If you are using packing tape, you can put it in several layers just to make sure that the seam is sealed pretty well and cold air doesn't get into the container. The seeds and the seedlings need to stay in a warmer environment. And like I said, use taller containers for taller vegetables like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, for example. Since our container is sealed pretty well and ventilation holes are pretty small, the soil in the container will stay moist for a long time. But when you check on containers, you can lift them a little bit, and if you feel like the container is too light, that means the soil is dry. In that case, you need to water your container. How do we water this container? It would be hard to open the lid and try to make the soil moist evenly. In this situation, with a container like this or those large soda bottles, fill up a box with water and then place the container into the water and leave it in there for about 30 minutes. And the soil will soak up the water through the drainage holes that you put on the bottom of the container. And leave it for about 30 minutes. You can have 2 or 3 containers depending on the size of your box. And then come back in 30 minutes and put the next batch of containers. And that's how you can easily water these containers. And that is why I like using boxes like this. I simply open the lid and water the soil when it needs to be watered. Where do we place these containers? Ideally, we'd want to put containers in a spot that gets full sun. Now, keep in mind that in milder climates, winters can get really warm days. For example, in a few days, our high is supposed to be 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And if I leave a container like this in 72 degrees Fahrenheit in full sun, all the seedlings will burn inside of the container. For that reason, in milder climates, I would move containers to a spot that get probably morning sun till about noon, and then afternoon shade from noon until evening. That's the convenience of using containers. You can move them in different locations and spots depending on the sun and weather that day. But make sure your containers are in a stable position where they're not going to be knocked down by animals or little children or wind. Make sure to protect your containers from cold wind. When you choose a location for your containers, make sure to put them in a place where you will be seeing them often, or you will be walking by them often. That way you'll be checking on them, and if they need to be watered, you'll water them, or if they need to be protected, or if they tipped over, you need to position them correctly. You can do all those things. If you put them really far away from your house where you never see them and you completely forget about them, then there's a very good chance that something bad might happen to those seedlings and containers. And like I mentioned before, if your days are really warm, make sure to open the lids of containers like this box, for example, because the seedlings might get too hot, and also I don't have any ventilation holes in the lid, so I have to really pay attention to our weather. After your seedlings sprout and you know that you expect really cold temperatures, make sure to either cover them with an additional cover or even bring them inside. For plants like tomatoes or peppers, if you expect really cold temperatures, those seedlings might not withstand those cold temperatures. And when it's the right time for your climate to plant your seedlings in the garden, make sure to do so. Don't let them stay in containers all crowded in that shallow soil for too long because they will not do well. And like I said, you don't need to harden off your seedlings. They've been in all kinds of weather and they're used to being outside, so you can move them into the ground right away. Make sure to separate them gently and be careful with their roots. Keep as many roots intact as possible. And even after you plant them in the ground, if you know that you expect really cold temperatures, make sure to cover them so the seedlings would survive. What plants can we winter sow? We can winter sow all kinds of plants: annuals, perennials, fruits, vegetables, herbs, native plants. They all can be winter sowed. And that's all on winter sowing. It's a fun and easy way to sow seeds and extends your garden season. Thank you so much for watching this video, and happy gardening!